Record. Okay. So, how is everyone? How is it?
Pretty good. Pretty
Yeah.
good.
Okay. All right. You guys
How are
need
you doing, Professor?
I'm doing pretty good. I've been at a lot of meetings. So let's get this show started. All right. So as you know, I had mentioned how I was going to have a gentleman from Microsoft come, but his grandmother passed away just very recently. And so I decided what I would do is ensure that you got something from this week, but then also later in October, I'm going to give you a day off. So we're doing a lecture early, and we might see if we can get our friend from Microsoft to come back. And if not, then we'll have other great guest speakers. But in the meantime, this is something that I plan to do in late October, and we will have some time to just kind of retreat, work on some assignments, and you'll have some free time later in the month. So I'll make up for the inconvenience. So today we're going to talk about leadership in journalism. So this is going to be like a two-parter, right? So part one, we'll focus on the different types of editors and leaderships that you would find in a newsroom. And in this part two, I want to talk about what makes a good leader. What does that person look like, and how do they act, and how do they think, and what type of vision do they have, and the habits that they form. So I want to ensure that you all think about leadership, because some of you are going to decide to be leaders. Some of you will rise up the ranks and end up being leaders. So I want to give you an opportunity to think about that, what that looks like. But first, just a very basic level of what editors and leadership looks like in journalism. Does that sound cool?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. So what does an editor do, right? And we talked a little bit about this before, what an editor does. You might remember, first, what is editing? We discussed this in week 2. So if you go back and look at the deck from week 2, you'll find that editing means to prepare content for publication, or to prepare content to get ready to distribute that content. So whatever platform, whether it's preparing it on radio, TV, online, social media, an editor preps that content so that it's published or distributed. And an editor will remove, add, condense, rewrite, or revise, right? So think of all those things. That's what editing is, just in the purest basic form. But I want you to know that editors can look different in different spaces. Number one, they can be an individual contributor, meaning that they don't have a team reporting into them, but they still have a lot of clout. Or that person can also be a people manager. That's my last position actually was an editor, and then responsible for a team where people actually report into me. But an editor can be either one. They can be an individual contributor, they can be a manager, but know that most editors in their environment have a lot of influence, right? So they have the ability to suggest stories, change stories, influence how the content looks, right? And pretty much all editors, whether they're an individual contributor or a people manager, they lead people. Their teams trust them, their management trusts them. They're the gatekeepers of this content and how it flows out, how it looks, oftentimes the final say before it goes out to the public, right? And editors shape and affect stories. So that makes you a pretty powerful person in a newsroom where your job is to create stories and then to distribute them. And then, of course, an editor improves the content. So the idea is that we create the content, and then an editor will improve the content to be distributed in its best form by the time that it goes out to the public. So that's what an editor does. So not only do they revise, rewrite, shape, condense, all of those things, they add, they remove, but they're people of influence, whether an individual contributor or not. So what does an editor do? What are they responsible for? We're on the left side of your screen. We're talking the tactical things, right? They fact check, they make sure that the facts are right. You called the person's name right, the place is right, the amount is right, the percentage is right, you did that, the facts are right, the spelling is correct, the grammar is correct, the punctuation is correct, the style is correct. And in fact, when I'm editing you all's columns, I'm looking for all of that. They made a claim, is it factual in the first place? Did they spell it right? And I'm always making notes about style and punctuation and all that. You deal with an editor, that's what you deal with. And then editors also on the other side of that, they can manage writers, people who are staff and people who do it on a freelance basis, people who are not staff that they lend their services to. Editors choose the direction of coverage. So that's usually a higher editor. So somebody who has someone reporting into them, someone whose scope is broader, maybe leading a newsroom, maybe leading several sections of a newsroom, but they choose what does that coverage look like. Editors are responsible for ideation. How do we come up with, actually, tell me what ideation means. Can someone tell me what ideation means?
Is it like creating other ideas?
Got it. Idea is the word. Ideation means coming up with an idea. And so you want, that's perfect. Thank you for that, Zach. It's you want, if you're an editor, you lead the process of getting other people to create ideas. And so at the end of the day, right, as creatives, as writers, as journalists, we're paid for our ideas. You come up with an idea and then we execute and distribute it. So that is a very valuable skill set to help other people come up with ideas and sift through their ideas. And then finally, they curate stories. They think about, okay, what story belongs, what doesn't, what should we be writing about, what should we commission and ask other people to do on our behalf for this publication. So they curate stories. So they do all those different things at different levels of editors. So that leads to the question, what type of editors exist in journalism? So I want to look at 6 different types. There's all kinds of editors, right? So I feel like this list could be 50 different titles, but these are the ones that are very, very common that pretty much across all newsrooms that you'll find, and their focus and responsibilities range. So I want to discuss this. So we've got 6 on here: the online editor, the copy editor, the associate editor, the contributing editor, the managing editor, and the editor-in-chief. And some of you, for the Maroon Tiger and other places, you actually might be these editors. So I'll tell you, share with you what it looks like out in the real world. So first, an online editor. And actually, this is probably something that might even feel innate to you because you're digital natives, but typically an online editor focuses only online stories, right? So it publishes just online. And it also entails things that are online platforms like social media and videos and photo galleries. Remember, we've talked a lot about headlines. The homepage, some people will be assigned that is their job. They are to focus on the homepage and that's it. So CNN.com has someone purely dedicated, or even a team of people dedicated to what that homepage looks like and how it is programmed. They usually say programming website. That's how you refer to it. So website sections. So if CNN.com has multiple sections, they have the political section, they have the global international section, and they have the sports section. They need all online, there may be different types of online editors to focus on the sections. And then of course, newsletters, so all these different online platforms and online editors concerning herself or himself with. And there goes that audience development thing again. They typically work with audience development editors, reviewing metrics, responding to metrics, and making content that responds to those numbers, which are people, right? So I want you to keep in mind that if you want to be an online editor, that means you love to learn new platforms. The new digital platform, the new social platform, emerging platforms is your thing. You are digitally savvy and you understand or are willing to learn to understand metrics and data. You're willing to change and you're willing to pivot very easily because online editors, what is there today and what is relevant today, tomorrow that platform may not be as relevant anymore. So you like to change, online editors. What questions do you have with that? No questions? Okay, let's go to number 2. So number 2 is the copy editor, right? And so I think copy editors have a lot more clout sometimes than they realize. Maybe they do, but copy editors, they check for grammar and formatting and punctuation and that lovely AP style that I'm always writing to you guys to remember and learn and keep learning your AP style. That's the copy editor's job. And that person understands different types of writing style, right? So they understand short form and long form. They understand first person, like the first two columns that you all wrote. They understand a feature story versus a news story versus a breaking news story. So they are very well versed in different types of writing styles and different types of formats. They have a strong knowledge of the English language. They understand what a past participle is, and they're proud of it. Very strong understanding of English language. And so usually copy editors in bigger entities, let's say, for example, the New York Times, they have a chief copy editor, and that person is a manager of all the people who check the grammar, check the formatting, check the punctuation, check for all these things. And then there's sometimes that chief copy editor is also named a standards editor. They set the standard for how we are to edit, for how we are to format, what our style looks like when we actually write it, publish it online or in print. The copy editor. Then there is the associate editor. Now, I feel like this one sounds sometimes a little bit nebulous. Like, what does that mean? Well, associate editor is someone who finds stories. They curate content. So basically, they're choosing topics that they know people will enjoy or will help them be informed or that they want to know. And typically an associate editor works at a magazine or they work at a newspaper. So, and lately actually online too as well. So considering a lot of magazines are online magazines and a lot of media outlets are online newspapers. And so an associate editor is a person who can also be called like a section editor, right? So they focus on that. They find content and they curate content, meaning they pick, they aggregate, they choose what's going to go out there, but they often do it for specific sections. So if they're a sports editor, a lifestyle editor, a politics editor, so sometimes you'll see them referred to as these names, very specific, a politics editor, but oftentimes you see an associate editor. But just know that an associate editor, their job is to find stories for that publication or that platform. And so that means that a person who's an associate editor loves to work with other people. Specifically, they love to work with writers and reporters and contributors, which can be a different type of work. People who are very proud of their work. They know how to communicate with them and even get them to change or alter, add, remove, consider. So if you want to be an associate editor, think about how much you enjoy working with other people who may be even attached to their own work. The next one I want to talk about is contributing editor. Have you guys heard of this, a contributing editor?
No.
No? Okay, so I'll tell you what a contributing editor is. It's exactly what it sounds like. You contribute. So they are people who choose. They have a whole lot of freedom. They choose what they will write and they choose what they will edit, right? And so they are essentially lending their services to a platform. So for example, if I am the editor-in-chief of Vox and I'm looking for a contributing editor, they tell me what they want to write about. So that sounds pretty cool, right? So know that they don't have a particular area that they have to cover, like a sports editor, a politics editor, or a lifestyle editor. They cover what they think is important and what they want to cover. And so
I got a question. Sorry,
Yeah,
Professor Smith, to cut you off.
No,
So
go
with
ahead.
contributing editors,
Mhm.
like you said, they just kind of see what they see fit. So kind of, are they more like,
Mhm.
I should say, less hands-on or like managed, I guess. So like
Mhm.
how you said they can edit what their own interests are.
Yeah.
So would they kind of just hop around the newsroom and see where they would like to like add on to their 2 cents?
They do. I mean, that's what exactly. They choose what they would like to contribute. So I decide what I want to focus on. I decide what I want to edit, what I want to work on. And then whoever is my boss, essentially, whoever is my editor, gives me a yay or nay. But they essentially are not confined to any boundaries of what they have to contribute. One of the most famous contributing editors actually is Andre Leon Talley. Has anybody heard of him? Andre Leon Talley. So I think there's actually a document from a couple of years ago, but Andre Leon Talley is he's a contributing editor, and we'll talk about his actual title, at Vogue magazine. He's one of the most powerful contributing editors in all of media. And so he writes what he wants. He goes to the shows he wants, he focuses on what he wants, and he does it for Vogue. So anyway, so good question. Thank you. I think that was Timmy, right? So others can make suggestions on what they report and write since they don't necessarily have a defined area. They do what they want. But it's also important to underscore that contributing editors are usually high profile, number one, like that Andre Leon Talley I'm telling you about. And number two, they're often freelancers, right? So they're not staff. They don't work for the website, the magazine, or the newspaper. they do their own thing, which is partially that's what gives them the power to do what they wish because they're not necessarily an employee. And then, so if you hear the word editor at large, that's the same thing as a contributing editor. It's just like a fancier title, but it's essentially a high profile freelancer who do what they choose to do. Any other questions? So the woman that you met earlier this semester named Jewel Wicker, with capital B, she said that she's going to be an editor at large. This is what she was referring to. I think I have make sure I have a question here. I see Zach says he has a question.
Yeah. So when it comes to like what gives people like the type of like credibility just to like contribute to like whenever they want to, what gives people that type of like power, you know what I mean?
So that's a great question. So usually they've paid their dues, Zach. They've worked at other publications or they've worked with other well-known editors or well-known people in their industry. So example for Andre Leontali, the editor at large of Vogue, he worked with major well-known other editors at Vogue. And then he also worked with major designers. And he was able to interview major, incredible designers. And so that gave him clout in the field to then turn around and be like, you know what, I want to do my own thing. And he had built an audience by then where he could come to a publication and be an editor at large, to be a contributing editor. So you don't start off as a contributing editor. You basically learn the field, you do the work, you end up being respected through your work. And then people want to have you as a contributing editor, because at that point, your name brings other people, it brings other people's attention to you, and you add that value to their platform. I encourage you to look up Andre Leontali. Actually, in my follow-up note, I'll send you the name of the documentary. I forget the name of it now, but he's also African-American. He's which is very rare in the fashion industry, and it's something like Vogue in general at Condé Nast. So the fact that he got to that level is incredible. Good question. So let's go next. Managing editor. Do you guys have a managing editor at your at the Maroon Tiger? Does anyone know?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Okay, so I'll tell you what a managing editor does. Pretty much managing editors are in all publications, and they're also in things like, certainly website, online things, newspaper. They're all over. So what does that mean? It's a pretty common title. So managing editor is one of the bosses, right? They are at the top. And that means they manage the operations and business of the publication. So what does that mean? You manage the operations. It means like the day-to-day, what makes that business function, you're in charge of. So you're in charge of hiring people. You're in charge of approving or firing people. You are in charge of budgets. And the bigger the newsroom, the bigger the budget, right? And when you got the money, you have the power. So these people are pretty powerful. You also choose what vendors you work with. So if you want to have, let's say, a person who an entity that does the actual printing, that you choose the printer, the managing editor would usually be involved in the decision, or just make the decision who's going to print this magazine, who's going to print this publication, who's going to host this website. I get to choose who the vendor is. And a managing editor also deals with freelancers. So but they are, in terms of not just who the freelancer is, that might be at an associate editor level, but like how much money we're going to put towards freelancers versus staff. So they have a lot of power when it comes to personnel. They have a lot of power when it comes to money, who gets hired, policies. So they run the day-to-day operations of that business. And so essentially it's a high-level management position. So if I was to equate it in like corporate America, it would be equivalent to the COO of a company. So that means typically people who report into a managing editor are other editors. So the direct reports usually are not the people who do like the day-to-day, but they're usually other people who are managers. And this person will almost always, in fact, I've never seen it otherwise, typically reporting to the editor-in-chief or the top journalist in his or her newsroom. And then I just want to really underscore that they're also journalists, so they understand business and budgets and hiring and firing and vendors and all those things, but they're journalists. They usually rise through the ranks. And they usually will even, it's not uncommon for a managing editor to write a column or share a thought or something through writing form, because they've come up as editor, as writing professionals through their career, but now they run the business for that publication. And you can find managing editors, like I said, online, TV, radio, and newspaper. So they're usually second in command is what a managing editor is. Any questions? Oh, okay, moving forward. Editor-in-chief. This might be what some of you aspire to do. ESPN.com has an editor-in-chief. CNN.com has an editor-in-chief. WashingtonPost.com has an editor-in-chief. Everybody's got an editor-in-chief. But what does that mean? We all know that that's like the top guy. But what does she or he really do day to day? Well, number one, they are the lead journalists. Out of all the journalists in the newsroom, they are at the top. So they're at the top of their website, they're at the top of their newspaper, they're at the top of their magazine, whatever publication. And so ultimately that means that responsibility lies with that person for the entire publication. So if a story is wrong, if people complain about the framing of the story, if something is inaccurate, it causes maybe bad press. That is the responsibility of the editor-in-chief. And that person, that one person, is responsible for all the journalists in that newsroom, from top all the way to bottom and everything in between. And so it's a lot of responsibility, because they're the ones setting the tone for the newsroom. They're the one deciding, for example, during the election season, a lot of editor-in-chiefs will choose, okay, our policy is that we don't pick sides. We don't say that we are endorsing a particular candidate. We are fair and balanced, and we will not do that. Other editor-in-chiefs set the tone and editorial policies and say, we are endorsing president, I won't say president, because let's say we're endorsing President Trump, or we are endorsing his opponent, Joe Biden, and they'll make that call. But that's the call of the editor-in-chief to even go that far. And they just provide the vision of this entire brand, right? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What is the tone like? Are we fun? Are we playful? Are we serious? Do we do all long form investigative? Or, they decide what this brand looks like. And so that means they have the final approval, even on things like layout and design and style. And we already talked about tone a little bit. It's not uncommon for that top person to get it on their desk before it goes to print or before it's published online, and they say yes or no when it comes to even things like the look and style and feel. So ultimately, an editor-in-chief is a leadership role. It's a very important one. It's also a lot of responsibility. But again, this is a person typically who knows how to write, and they're a journalist through and through. So they will write columns and editorial, and they'll often do it from taking the stance like, this is what this publication's point of view is. I'm saying it on behalf of all the journalists who work here. This is what we believe. This is how we feel. This is what we think. And so that means they represent the publication to the public. And then you'll see editors and editors-in-chiefs out at social events. So yeah, they're representing everybody. And it's a lot. So you usually hear the title editor just by itself, editor-in-chief, which is kind of old school at this point. And then I just want you to know, if you also hear the term executive editor, that is the same thing as editor-in-chief. So some of the places I know are like the Dallas Morning News. I believe they don't have an editor-in-chief, they have an executive editor. The Miami Herald has an executive editor. And then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has an editor. So all those things, editor, editor-in-chief, executive editor, means the same thing. It means the top journalist in the newsroom.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
If it means the same thing, why is it like different words and stuff?
Why is it different? I don't know. I guess people have the ability to label it what they want. I mean, editor-in-chief, honestly, like I said, it's more of an old school term. Most people don't really talk like that anymore. They usually call it an executive editor or an editor, but I mean, same thing. I think that people over time just call things different names, label it differently. What other question?
So I'm not sure if I caught it if you said it or not. How long does it take to become a editor-in-chief?
How long? If I knew that, oh my gosh, I could put it in a bottle and sell it. I don't know how long. I mean, I think that just depends on, I don't think there's an answer for that. At the end of the, I can't tell you 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, because it just depends on the person's career and if they do become that or not. I mean, some people are able to carve that out sooner than others, but you have to basically overcome a lot, learn a lot, take on a lot. They usually do many different positions before they ever become something like an executive editor. They usually have reported, they've written, they've copy edited, they've done all of that. By the time that they're editor in chief, they maybe even were managing editors, so they understand the business, right? So an editor or an executive editor is someone who has spent many years being a journalist in different forms and being different types of editors before they, so just keep that in mind. But I don't have a number, but I will say you pay you have a good foundation by the time that somebody is hiring you to be an editor, executive editor.
And I guess the process, could you say that it'll be in part on the work that you have done, but also who you know too?
Well, I mean, there's always a part of who you know. I think there's always a network involved. I mean, you have to get along with people, right? And that's just anything. That's not just an editor in chief. The higher you go, the more important it is that you know how to get along with people, how to have soft skills, how to stay connected with folks over time, and then how to be visible and remain valuable. So yeah, I guess you could say who you know. I personally think it's a combination. I also think that changes just from demographic to demographic, the who you know thing, but that's a personal belief. But you have to have networks and social skills. That's just a fact. And in fact, if you're going to be a good editor in chief and represent your entire publication and all these people who are under you to the public and social events, you better know people and how to talk to people. So extrovertedness helps in this job. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So next, I want to discuss what does it take to become an editor. Now, I meant any type of editor. So you all have asked maybe specifically about some, and we can go through that, but I could just tell you in a very generic sense, typically what it takes. So typically, an editor has some type of bachelor's degree, right? And it's usually in media, journalism, English. It's not uncommon though for people to have degrees in political science, or they might have a degree in history or government or things like that. So it just depends on what they decided to focus on. But usually a bachelor's degree, often in media, journalism, English. Political science is a popular one as well for people to become journalists and then editors overall. And then they've also, like I said, they've paid their dues. They've done other writing and editorial roles. They've done internships. They've learned the business. They've learned the business by doing the role. That's important. So the experience part. And then they have the ability to improve writing. So they don't just consume writing, they improve it. And they have the ability, like Zach was talking about, they have the ability to ideate and contribute story ideas. Remember, in any creative field, not just journalism, your ideas are your value. They equal each other. So be careful with your ideas. And then they could ask good questions. This whole semester, we've been talking about that, right? We read a whole book on Change Your Questions, Change Your Life. But typically an editor, they're great at asking questions. They're great at poking holes at things. They're great at thinking beyond that surface level, right? So that means they're a critical thinker. And we talked about critical thinking and thinking, not just accepting what's put in front of us, but asking the questions, diving deeper, wondering why we're framing things why we're asking what we're asking, who we're interviewing. Do we need to cover this story? Should we be not covering this story? And why are we doing that? So they're thinking more critically about every piece of content, every idea. That makes a good editor. And they understand and know that audience. We talked about audience before. They understand who's reading them. They understand who's clicking on their posts. They understand who's subscribing to them. They have a real good understanding. So that's a different person who subscribes and reads Vogue magazine than ESPN magazine. Two different audiences, and they know that. And they, not only do they know that, they understand it and what those people want. I don't think there's any surprise here that an editor loves words, right? They love looking at words, feeling words, reading words, writing words, editing words. Words are their life. And so that means they love a good story. They love to help people shape their stories and do some storytelling. And then last, but certainly not least, an editor has a very strong grasp of grammar and flow. Some of you may have seen me write to you, your flow, the flow was good, or watch your flow, meaning that it's just sequential and I can easily follow this story. So an editor is going to be looking for that. They're going to look at something and make sure the grammar and punctuation is correct, but then they're also going to make sure that this flows so that people, when I know that when somebody reads it, they can easily follow it. It makes sense. All right. What questions do you have? All right. All right. So this is my caveat for you all, but the big but. I said all of this, right? They typically have a degree. They typically have internships, and they're writing. They've written or and been in editorial roles. They've done all this stuff. But I do want you to just know that people have unique backgrounds to bring to the table, and so editors, each editor's skill set and experience can look very different. And so that's exactly like I'm telling you. Somebody could have been a lawyer, and once they've become a lawyer, maybe they then become a legal analyst for a publication or a TV network. And once they become a legal analyst, maybe they become a chief legal analyst, and they become they're now a journalist. But they're qualified to do that work because at one point they were a lawyer, or maybe continue to practice law. So just know that everybody has unique backgrounds to bring to the table. And exactly with ESPN, if somebody used to play basketball, of course, they're knowledgeable in a way, in a technical way that a lot of people aren't, even if they're covering it. So they just have that to bring to the table, and they can be a contributor in that way. So just know every editor has a different skill set. Nothing is set in stone, but those are typically what people will often take the path to do to become an editor. All right, so this is my last slide for you all. I just want to side note. Now I did all of this, right? I said, let's see if I can find it. I said, oh, well, what are the different type of editors that exist? I said online, copy editor, associate, contributing, managing editor, editor-in-chief, executive editor, or editor. But those things can take different forms in different platforms. So even though it may be named something different, the intent is the same. So in TV, radio, instead of executive editor or editor-in-chief or editor, it's called the news director. And I want you to know that if you get into books, right, because oftentimes journalists will become book editors, a developmental editor is the same thing as like a copy editor, someone who helps you with style and flow and what to take in and what to take out. An acquisition editor in books, that's someone who decides what books will actually, they'll acquire the books. They will decide what we should take to this publication house and say, okay, this publisher, I think you should print the book. And that's similar to what an associate editor does, right? Where that person is choosing, they're curating, they're picking. So in books, it's a developmental editor, an acquisition editor, and then online, you have to see it broken down into segments. So not just online editor, the bigger the newsroom, the more people do that online product. So you might see a newsletter editor or social media editor. You'll see all kinds of things. You might see a podcast editor, so any digital form. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is you might hear of deputy editors, and that is a general term. In essence, basically, a deputy editor is someone who is in leadership or in management, and they are over several parts. So a deputy editor might report into this managing editor who's responsible for all of these operations, but the deputy editor is going to pay really close attention to several areas, focuses of content. So maybe that deputy editor is in charge of politics, breaking news, and investigative. And that person, all of that is in their purview. And then another deputy editor will be responsible for lifestyle, sports, and I don't know, dining or something like that. So just know that you might hear some of these terms thrown around, depending on the platform that you work with, decide to work for, but all of it has that same foundation and base for you to know what kind of editor you're working with, or what you're applying to, or what you might be interested in. Fair enough?
So a deputy editor,
Mhm.
I guess, wouldn't take over any of the responsibilities of the editor if, let's say, for some reason the editor were unable to
Mhm.
do something.
Mhm. They could, they're high enough to. So a deputy editor is a pretty high level person. Probably like a deputy editor would probably be like number 3 in a newsroom, in a large newsroom. So there would be the executive editor, that top editor. There would be the managing editor who is responsible for all those important business decisions. And then there would usually be like a deputy editor who is over all of the people who do editorial. So it wouldn't be uncommon for an editor in chief to go to a deputy editor and have them fill in them for, and I've seen it, filling them for maybe to write something. I want you to write this column, or I won't be able to go to this event. I want you to represent the paper or the magazine or the website. So deputy editors are pretty high. And like I said, they're people who usually have more than one focus under them. So they have to understand a whole lot because they're not just focusing just on sports. They're focused on sports and lifestyle. And maybe they also have, the food and food critics or something like that. So they know a lot. What other questions do you have? Is that it? Okay. Well, if you don't have any questions, I have my question slide, so you're more than welcome to interrupt me. But that is kind of like my overview. The reason I shared, now stop sharing my screen here. And I'll show you something else I wanted to talk to you about. But the reason that I shared this is because nobody ever broke it down for me. It's just something I had to learn and pick up at every job that I went to. And then I noticed that there's just a pattern pretty much across different types of newsrooms. So I don't want you to have that same experience. I want you to be able to go in there and understand that when somebody says, I'm a managing editor, who you're talking to, that you know that you're talking to a very powerful person, who has influence over many different parts, such as the business and the editorial and all of that. So hopefully you find that useful. Fair enough?
Yes, it is.
Okay. There's one thing I wanted to show you. I want to ask you, and I'll bring it up as I'm talking here, and then I'll let you go early. For those who got a chance to go to the Hammond's house, what did you think? And I will read your discussion board post, but just in general for conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. I've never been, well, I don't go to too many art museums myself, but to go to this one is pretty unique because it was just like a very old house. It felt, it felt like historic, and I felt kind of like at home in a way, looking at all the type of artwork and stuff. So it was pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I felt the same way. And the reason that I learned about the Hammond's house is because I had a reporter on my team who I edited, and I read a lot of her work about the exhibits that would come through the Hammond's house. So I figured just to give some really good context, or to try to give some context for you, the Hammond's house has some of the most prolific African-American artists ever basically showing it. So the exhibits will change, and they have a permanent collection that they can bring out at any point. But some of the people who get into that museum as humble as it feels and as close as it feels are some pretty popular, successful, as far as visibility and commercialness, and from the commercial standpoint of selling their art. One of the people that touched me was Benny Andrews. Did anybody get a chance to learn about Benny Andrews? He was one of the artists that they showed there.
Yeah.
No? Okay, so I'll just share this with you. Let me share my screen. So Benny Andrews, who actually passed away in 2006. This is a gentleman. I just want to show you some of the work, because I think some of the work that they had there I don't know that it completely represented like some of the stuff but he's known for covering Black life, right? And so he's done beautiful pieces of art. Let me share my screen. That he's covered by his exhibit, most recent exhibit is in MoMA, the Modern Museum of Art, in New York City. And the New York Times, even after his death, even a couple of weeks ago, covered Benny Andrews. So that's just to give you an idea of, can you see my screen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
To give you an idea of like how prolific these folks are. So I think, so even when he passed away, the New York Times covered him, and they recently covered his work because it's being featured at MoMA. So these are the men and women that you're looking at. So there was a couple documentaries. If you ever want to go back between now and think early January. They actually have 3 documentaries in the back room. And for those who haven't gone yet, in the back room to sit down and watch and learn about these artists. He actually was, this is a person that his mom had to fight for him to be educated as far as high school, not education like you all, privileged in a prestigious college, but just to even go to high school. And he was able to end up going to Chicago, get a bachelor's degree, and then make his name in New York. So, and then I just want to show you like, for example, I said like he does is Black Life. This is a good example of the type of work that he would do. And this is Benny Andrews. So if you get a chance just to really dive into the art and the artist, learn more. Because remember when we talked about critiquing a body of work or a piece of art, part of it is understanding the artist and their background and then being able to share it with that person. So remember that as you continue to write and learn how to write, that get to know the artist as well when you critique their work, if you decide to do that. So you can see how much Benny Andrews painting cost here. So if anybody has that at the door around, power to you. But that's who you were looking at. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. All right. Great. All right, so I will stop recording. First, I'll stop share, and then I will stop recording.